Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear guests, I would like to start the session of this Dissertation Council for the dissertation defense of Pioch Martin to seek the degree of candidate of economic sciences in the specialty 08-0014 global economy, and the topic is the cooperation of emerging countries in global governance, BRICS and the WTO. According to the decree of St. Petersburg State University dated the 15th of March 2018, I, Nikita Lomagin, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of Department of Global Economy, St. Petersburg State University, was appointed Chairman of this Dissertation Council. Also, the Dissertation Council includes Vyacheslav Shevchukov, Professor of Department of Economic Theory and Economic Policy, St. Petersburg State University, Tatiana Isachenko, Professor of Department of International Economic Relations and Foreign Relations of St. Petersburg, of Moscow State University Institute of International Relations, which is also University of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Kadashnikov, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Director of the branch of High School of Economics, St. Petersburg State University, and also on the remote mode we have Cord Yakubite, Professor, Hamburg University. According to the decree of the federal law dated 2308 to 1996, St. Petersburg State University received the right to grant scientific academic degrees, and there was an act in St. Petersburg State University on the basis of this. According to this act, the session of the Dissertation Council is legitimate if no less than 3/3 of the established membership of the Dissertation Council, but not fewer than 4 people are present. Our session consists of 5 members. All members are included in this session, and we have 1 member of board in remote mode. And I would like to set the following procedure for this Dissertation Council. First, we're going to have a short a presentation of the chairman about the documentation that the defendant presented, then a short presentation of the defendant that covers the dissertation, 15 minutes, then there will be questions to the defendant to cover the presentation, and then questions, answers of not more than 2 minutes, and then there will be reviews read, and also members of the board will present as well, and present their recommendations, criticism, etc. And then there will be responses of the defendant to the commentaries of the dissertation board members, not more than 15 minutes, then answers, and then open discussion, and then the supervisor will also speak, and also after that we're going to have a discussion of after the replies of the defendant. We'll discuss the decision, and then open voting on awarding or non-awarding of the dissertation degree, and of course at the end there will be final concluding statement from defendant. And I also would like to remind you that live broadcast is on the website of St. Petersburg State University. Simultaneous interpretation is done from Russian into English and from English into Russian. And I would like to start the first point, item of the dissertation. The dissertation of Pioch Martin to seeking a degree of candidate of sciences in the concentration 08-0014 global economy, and the topic of Emerging Economies, Cooperation and Global Governance, the BRICS and International Trade and the WTO, was accepted for defense on the 15th of 2018. The Dissertation Council was then established by a decree of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University on the same date. And as I already mentioned, all the members of the Dissertation Council. And so, what documentation has been presented? First of all, a written statement of the defendant addressed to the rector of St. Petersburg State University, Professor Pioch, and then there's a review of the academic supervisor, the head of the Department of Global Economy, Professor Turin. Then the list of publications consists of 11 papers which cover most the key items of the dissertation, including 3 papers that were published in indexed publications that are listed by the Minister of Education of the Russian Federation. There's a certificate of study which stated that he passed, Martin Pioch passed all the necessary exams and including history and philosophy of science, excellent, foreign language, good, and then a special discipline, which global economy, excellent. There's a statement on the recommendation of dissertation to defense that is sealed by the act of the Academic Center of State University, and there's a URL of this where the PDF file is placed. And then the translation of the master's degree diploma of Hamburg University that was issued to Pioch Martin on the 18th of September 2014, and its equivalent of and then the statement of the Minister of Education that certifies that the qualification of Mr. Pioch actually conforms to the master's level of in political science of Russia. Then dissertation in Russian and in English, both in soft and hard copies, and the dissertation complies with the requirements of St. Petersburg State University and the state requirements. And I would like to now go to the main part of the session, and Mr. Pioch, you're given the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear professors, also from my side, a very warm welcome to my defense. The research which I will present to you today is based on and part of the Primo Marie Curie network, which enabled me from October 2014 until September 2017 to conduct my research in St. Petersburg and other places, notable Moscow, Geneva, London, and Oxford. The title of my thesis is Emerging Economies, Cooperation and Global Governance, the BRICS, International Trade, and the WTO. We decided at the department that this project should focus on one specific institution, the WTO, because the number of differences between the BRICS inside of the WTO is already so big and makes, for example, a comparison with other institutions not meaningful. Further, this work counters the assumptions that the BRICS are challengers or reformers, that the BRICS want to reshape the international order, that there's a rising conflict of ideologies or ideas. This work is investigating if there's any empirical evidence on those that could prove or disprove these assumptions. Therefore, the main question of my thesis is, do the BRICS have combined economic interests in international trade, which they can promote, embed in the international trading system? In order to find this out, there are 3 sub-questions which have to be answered. The first is, what are the economic interests of the BRICS in trade? The second is, how do the BRICS cooperate as a group in the WTO? And the third is then, what are the outcome and the effects of BRICS cooperation, actually? The research design looks as follows. This is a case study of BRICS trade patterns and BRICS cooperation in the WTO from 2009 until 2016. 2009 as a year the BRICS officially started to cooperate, and 2016 as a time-wise end, because this thesis was written in 2017. Methodological, this work is using a mixed method approach of quantitative cluster analysis and qualitative expert interviews. The main reason for this is that the pure quantitative data research produced explanation gaps, and those should be filled by the research done in the qualitative interviews. So the cluster analysis provides a classification of the BRICS countries in a bigger scheme of all WTO member states, while the expert interviews look at the quality of this cooperation. About the novelty. I identified a significant gap of empirical research in the relevant literature of the BRICS, which probably led to the assumption that the BRICS, in my point of view, are misunderstood or misdescribed in the relevant literature. Therefore, I took it for myself to conduct the first comprehensive analysis of the BRICS in the WTO under the assumption that they need to have some kind of common agenda in order to fit into those BRICS concepts that exist in the literature. Out of self-gathered data, I conducted cluster analysis in order to find out how much the BRICS actually have in common in this large setting of around 160 countries. Also, the approach of using a mixed method design with interviews in order to better unveil the actions behind the curtain of international institutions is rather new for economics. Finally, the main conclusion of this thesis has not yet been published before. I will come in more detail to this later, but my findings show that the BRICS are neither challengers nor reformers in the current international trading system, but that they have a strong interest in preserving the status quo of the institution. Now, I would like to spend 2 minutes to talk about the BRICS themselves. The term BRICS is not a natural concept of countries, but it's some kind of political alliance based on the ambitions of some emerging economies to participate stronger in the international system and to increase cooperation. Since 2009, the BRICS have constantly increased their cooperation in many areas. However, they mainly remain a loose network of bilateral relations. Until today, there are 3 phases of BRICS cooperation. After a phase of creation, one can identify a period of stabilization which was characterized by the construction of the NDB, the New Development Bank, and the broadening of the relationship by cooperating in more institutions and on more issues. And now we are in a phase of consolidation in which the BRICS summits have become some kind of normal. However, trade has always been an underdeveloped issue and holds out of 15 policy areas the second lowest compliance of BRICS decision. Smaller is only the cooperation in regional security issues out of quite obvious reasons, I think. Quite important for this work
Очень важным для моей работы является понимание того, что концепция стран БРИКС была создана, исходит изнутри. Это именно внутреннее желание стран сотрудничать на арене глобальной торговли, снизить торговые барьеры и повысить торговый оборот между этими странами. В 2008
Of course, one could argue here that an increasing of the trade volume also leads to an increasing of the trade measures. However, if there is a real ambition to reduce barriers and to cooperate in this area, I think the picture would look different. Also, talks about BRICS trade agreements take place in academic circles. However, the smaller BRICS countries so far fear the effects of opening their own markets to the trade with China. Inside of the group, the BRICS actually prefer bilateral talks. So it is quite typical for the BRICS that in the framework of a group of 5, 2 of them sign a bilateral agreement. Now I will briefly present the results of the cluster analysis and the expert interviews before I close with the main findings of my presentation. First, I did an analysis of 7 macro trade variables, and on this map here on the slide we can see the results of the trade cluster analysis. We can see 4 clusters differentiated by its 4 colors. And we see also the location of the BRICS inside of these clusters. We see up in the corner, the dark blue, this is China. In a small cluster, cluster in which are also the United States, Germany, France, the UK, Hong Kong, and Japan. Then we see a little bit bigger light blue cluster with India and South Africa in it. Then we see Russia in the red cluster and Brazil in the green cluster. It is obvious out of this table that the BRICS are not in the same group if we compare all WTO member states on the same variables. To understand the clusters, we take a quite quick look at the cluster composition. Red stands for a high value, blue stands for low value. We see that the first three maps is a little bit about the composition of the first cluster with China, of the small one. We see that they are the highest values in export in goods and export in services. As well, if we look at trade balances, we have the most extreme values, positive as well as negative, also in this cluster. If you want to understand the other clusters, we take a look at these variables, and we see the composition of the others. The cluster with Brazil is mainly defined by the export of agricultural products, the one with Russia, obviously by the exporting of fuel and mining products, and the big one with India and South Africa, as well as the small one with China, by the export of manufactured products. However, if we look at the lower right last slide about MFN applied tariffs, there is not really any kind of shape or any kind of pattern to see. We only can see that the BRICS are located in the areas where we have a little bit higher values inside of their clusters. So this led me to the idea to conduct a second analysis where I don't look only on trade variables, but where I look especially at tariff variables. This is the second picture, and here we see quite a different picture. Except South Africa, we find Russia, China, Brazil, and India in the same cluster. To speed things up, I will not again go through all variables, but just shortly describe the clusters. In the small two blue clusters, we find nearly exclusive least developed countries. Only the emerging economies, Indonesia and Turkey, are in those as well. The two blue clusters are mainly defined by high rates of tariffs, not full coverage of tariff lines, and low duty-free rates. Then in cluster C, we see the original 4 BRIC countries, but also other emerging economies as South Korea or Saudi Arabia are in this cluster located. Main features are higher average tariffs, nearly no duty-free lines, a higher share of non-add value duties, a larger number of tariff rates higher than 50%, and to some extent a larger variation of tariff rates. And then in cluster 1 and 2, we can also say together, just to summarize here, we can find the lowest protectionist group of countries. Next to the outliner South Africa, we find here all developed countries. So all European Union countries, Canada, United States are in the light green around South Africa located. Also the other emerging economy, Mexico, is in this group. This group patterns are mainly low average tariff lines, nearly no high tariffs at all, low non-add value duties, and a higher share of duty-free lines. Therefore, if you see a clear decision or division here, a clear division of the largest economies in the light green and in the bigger green cluster. We see the largest developed economies are comparable, a little more open, have comparable, a little less high tariff barriers, while the largest developing economies and the 4 BRIC have a comparable higher level of tariffs. Not the highest one, but a comparable higher level of tariffs. Now we take a look at the expert interviews. Qualitative expert interviews offer a chance to uncover areas with limited available data. There is no data on talks in political circles. However, the answers are subjective and limited to the interview's worldview. Also, experts don't have absolute knowledge. They can also be wrong sometimes. During 2 field trips in Moscow and Geneva, I spoke with experts from BRICS delegations, academia, the WTO, UNCTAD, and other institutions. However, due to confidentiality and limited access to all BRICS delegations, the outcome of the interviews is not systematically comparable. I cannot say what are the differences, for example, between South African and Brazilian delegation views. The outcome can only be used to see if there are similar patterns of assumptions, so similar ideas inside of these interviews. There were 3 main statements I found in those interviews. The first is that all interviews stated that the BRICS do not form a coherent bloc in the WTO because they're quite too different from each other. I have 2 examples. There are no trickle-down effects of the head of state cooperation in the area of trade. BRICS are not the WTO group. The second says the BRICS do their best to align with each other in the WTO. However, they are so profoundly different that this seems impossible. The second statement is that the BRICS are not only different in the economic patterns, but they also do not share the same ideas on reforming the WTO. Russia is highly interested in strengthening and clarifying the rules on terminology of the WTO, while India and South Africa prefer unclarity, mainly as leverage in negotiations. Or the second quote I choose here is that China would like to see a reform of trade remedies, while the 4 other countries have little interest in doing so. However, the third finding of the interviews is that several interviewees stated there is some kind of sense of solidarity and cooperation between the BRICS and the WTO. I picked here those quotes. Besides the differences, the BRICS have created some kind of space for action in solidarity with each other. BRICS do not criticize BRICS in the WTO. And the second one is that the BRICS as a construct is very easily accepted by the officials due to their complete avoidance of conflict. The BRICS are a convenient vehicle for thinking, the exchange of information, and from learning together. Now I will come to the results of, I will finally quickly present the main results of this work. First, the current literature is not sufficiently covering the cooperation of emerging powers in the WTO and the international trading system, which leads to overly optimistic or overly pessimistic assumptions. My analysis of the relevant literature especially points towards the lack of empirical research in support of these theories. I have shown that there are 3 main debates that's actually existing at the moment, however, they are partly contradicting each other. Secondly, the BRICS do not share significant trade patterns, which makes cooperation and trade issues between them very complicated. We can see also the low compliance rates of the BRICS trade in the low compliance rate of the results to the BRICS summits in the area of trade. Thirdly, however, the BRICS share indeed a higher level of tariffs in comparison with other states, which points to their interest in preserving a higher level of protectionism to secure current national interest. I have discussed in the theory part of my thesis different concepts for emerging economies. They mostly share the assumption that emerging economies support a stronger intervention of the state on the national economies than developed countries do. This higher level of tariff supports this view. The fourth finding, in my last slide, the BRICS are steadily increasing their cooperation, also in the WTO. This cooperation, however, does not aim on harmonization, but it is there to support each other, to learn together. This is fundamentally different from most Western conceptions or the European model of cooperation. Cooperation can lead to assimilation, but does not have to lead to assimilation. Fifth, the future of the Doha Development Agenda and the WTO depend on the level of integration and participation of emerging economies. For the BRICS, the WTO is an important institution for the economic development. They use the knowledge, infrastructure, and rule-based system of the WTO for their advantage. Further, we saw from Cancun until Bali and Buenos Aires today that the outcome of the WTO ministerials depends on the decisions of the BRICS. So the WTO has become kind of a playground for BRICS to test their policy impacts. And I'm at 15 minutes. I will just say my last 6th point and then finish. The WTO and the current international trading system are not challenged by any alternative order proclaimed by emerging economies. The BRICS states have a high interest in stable, fair, and liberal trade, international trade. They simply demand their inclusion. One can maybe say that the fan club of the WTO in the year of 2018 lies in the emerging economies, while the established Western bloc has become more of the main challenger of the WTO and of multilateralism recently. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for questions for this paper. Members of the council, colleagues. Thank you very much, Martin, for your presentation and for the additional characterization of your paper, of your work. What is one of the tasks you specified to identify the directions where BRICS countries could be united in the WTO. So, can you specify that? Because in your work, these directions and these themes were not clearly stated. Could you please identify them? What directions the BRICS countries could cooperate within the WTO? Thank you.
So I understand the question in what directions the BRICS could cooperate in the WTO. The main point of cooperation in the WTO is learning together, learning from each other. So the BRICS have meetings where they speak how, for example, they share the information of which kind of anti-duty measures, anti-dumping measures the one country has. So they had a conference in Brazil where the BRICS meet and share the information on this level, so to learn the institution. And the same point is what I heard inside of the WTO, is that the BRICS support each other. If one BRIC country is strongly criticized, so if there in some sessions at the WTO, if developed countries criticize one BRIC countries and they spoke at WTO from a process, they call it, they start a train against one country where one delegation after the other starts to criticize. The BRICS try to intervene and to stop those trains. So the position of the single BRICS has become much stronger. So it's not just South Africa being criticized from maybe 20 countries, but the moment this starts, the other countries will say, well, we don't share this criticism. And this kind of support, this is what I spoke about, solidarity. So what we could not expect is that the BRICS will come up with a common idea. They don't have a common vision. But they share solidarity, and this is some kind of support. This is the only support I found out.
In the follow-up to Tatiana Ivanovna's question, I would like just suggesting that China and Russia, not only within the WTO but in other international organizations, often join the ranks of those who defend the oppressed, and part of the BRICS is not necessarily the condition for them to express this solidarity, and that's the identity of BRICS. Does it influence the behavior of states, or can we not measure it?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. It's a crucial point. I can't prove that. I looked at this institution. What I heard from the delegations and also from staff at the WTO is simply that the level of solidarity and the level of cooperation is increasing. So not only do they have these meetings, which they have exclusively around WTO topics, so they meet at least 2 times, sometimes more, on high levels at the WTO where they speak about those issues. This is new, this is BRICS. The question, if they support each other when they get criticized, yes, it probably also happens in other institutions, for sure. And also this kind of support of the BRICS in the WTO did not start with BRICS, it started at Cancun in 2003, where the BRICS was just a concept from an economist so far. However, when you speak with the delegations, you can find some kind of that they tell you, yes, we don't criticize each other on this global level, we have understandings, we don't do it here publicly. If I have a problem with my other delegations, I do it bilateral, I talk to them directly, I don't use this institution. So this seems to be new. This hasn't been there before.
To clarify your view on the economic principles that lie behind the economic behavior of people, of countries in the WTO. Your point of view is that we have to assess this common agenda through common advantages. And if this structure of comparative advantages is close, then these countries will have close motives to the WTO agenda, and you're trying to prove that the structure of this comparative advantages and the behavior. If we look at this from a different angle, at this issue, when we look at the pattern of competitive advantages, we usually think about what exists, and sometimes this is what countries wish to implement in their economic policy. And in this case, these intentions and maybe doesn't hold ground, and maybe the countries want to go away from this. Do you think that this changing environment will change the conclusions that you're making?
Well, thank you for your question. I hope I got everything right here again. I started my theoretical part of my thesis, which I haven't discussed here so much, from the assumption that the national interest and the view how the country looks defines the national interest of the country, and the government is supporting this. Well, if the country fundamentally changes its economic infrastructure or the economic view, if a country, Brazil has done this in the 90s, had this an immense industry of agricultural production, where agricultural production became extremely important. Well, of course, this changes the outcome, it changes the variables, and I have to do the analysis again. One thing which is here quite important is that a very interesting other kind of study would be to look at the single BRICS and identify what does Russia actually want and what is different between Russia and China. However, this was not the main purpose of my thesis. The main purpose of my thesis is to have the sample of 160 countries. And if I have a sample of 160 countries, I cannot go so much into detail of every single country. Would be a very interesting other research. I have one paper of Brazil in agriculture about exactly this issue. But this is simple, that I use the data which is available about status quo, what we have right now, how the economy looks like now. If the economy is transitioning, if one country is changing hugely, yes. But these are the trade variables. And one could argue about if it's really like the country is following this strong national interest. One could challenge the theory of rational choice in this point of view. I'm open for that. I used it. However, if we look at a second cluster analysis where we look at tariffs, that's a little bit different topic, because this doesn't really depend on how the economy is composed. So we have agriculture exporting, manufacturing, and fewer mining exporting countries, and they all share the same tariff pattern. So this has to have other reasons.
Do you have any questions from the other? Then we have reviews to read out. External reviews are not here. Well, there are no external reviews. The members of the Dissertation Council submitted their reviews and in time, and except Gordon Jacobite's review. But nevertheless, the board accepts this review for consideration, and all these reviews are uploaded at the website, St. Petersburg State University. Maybe we should not read out the whole of them. Maybe the colleagues would emphasize the key points of their reviews only, so that our work can proceed in an expedient way. And I would like to now start the review. The reviews, Professor Isachenko, then Professor Kadachnikov, then Professor Shevchukov. Then discussion will be joined by Gordon Jacobite and from Hamburg, and then in conclusion I will speak. Please, Tatiana Mikhailovna. Thank you very much, dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council. I will not dwell on the relevance of the topic because this is undoubtful and it doesn't need comment, and the positive characteristics are there as well, and my review of course covers that, and I would like to now emphasize only some moments that need clarification, or maybe that I could question in this context. Well, I have page numbers, of course, in my review, so it would be interesting to know what arguments the author used to prove the point that international trade is the main driver of international economic cooperation or of global economy. So what parameters he uses to prove that? So it's not clear what how WTO introduces infrastructure, international infrastructure, and maybe this is part of the translation, and then the diminishing of protectionism. I think that the development that we are envisaging now is including transnational corporations, is actually increasing, and a lot of policy measures and other protectionist measures contribute to that. And there are some duty-free rates and then zero rates of customs duties. Are they the same, or tariffs they're called? Are they the same? And then the share of duties that are put on commodities, are they equivalent to valorized duties, or are they just maybe incorrect translations? I would also like to see some comparative analysis of basic macro and economic analysis and strategies, because before we analyze positions in the world arena, we have to understand how they compare to each other in macroeconomic parameters and just the value of their economies. And of course, the work produces a very positive impression. Econometric part is excellent, and then I hope that this work will contribute to the theory. Thank you. Professor Kadishnikov now.
Thank you. Well, I would like to focus on the key findings of the thesis. I mean, what I think crucial, the most valuable thing about this dissertation is to identify the factors, the implications that shape long-term cooperation between BRICS countries beyond geopolitical considerations. So the existing consensus, academic consensus, is quite the opposite, actually. Namely that geopolitics is an only sustainable factor that brings BRICS together. This is indeed the ultimate value of your dissertation. This makes it so relevant. In responding to this challenge, you managed to come up with two major conclusions that I would like to focus on. The first conclusion is that long-term economic interests is closely related to priorities. And this does not let us identify some integral agenda in the trade activities of these countries across various formats, across various platforms and institutions. The second one is, the first one is what makes these countries so different in terms of their behavioral patterns, if I may put it so. In responding to this challenge, you resort to cluster analysis, and I'm discordant with Tatiana Mikhailovna in the fact that this clusterization, the clusterization of different parameters and the attempt to find the position of BRICS countries in this cluster analysis, this is indeed a success. And this analysis is topped up by a qualitative analysis, by expert interviews to support it. So this makes this analysis so evidence-based. So I'm going to ask a question, but this question does not invalidate your dissertation and your findings. And the second crucial statement, which also generates lots of disputes among scholars, is whether BRICS countries are interested in alternative international economic order. The reply suggested in the dissertation is not trivial, far not trivial. Namely, this claims that BRICS countries are just a follow-up to the existing global governance pattern, which means that this is no threat to the existing institutions. This is a long-term statement that has an enormous outlook into the future, political outlook, economic outlook. And this makes your research, your investigations so valuable and successful. I believe that your education played a crucial role, your broad-based education played the crucial role and enabled you to generate such a non-trivial result. Thank you so much. Professor Shavchukov, St. Petersburg University professor, please.
Dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, despite this little interruption, I need to stipulate the key points of my review. The review is positive, and nevertheless, I would like to start with the relevance of this research, because very important, both for the logic of the author's concept of the dissertation, and the relevance includes this point: globalization process have formed the global financial structure in the 1980s, and since then countries have built their economic policies on the structure, including investment, international cooperation, and the BRICS countries have become a leading regional association that are unlike the European Union, but is going in the same direction. I would like to emphasize the points that talk about the regionality and the importance. The BRICS have contributed to the edifying of the WTO, not destroying international cooperation, and this is a concept of cluster, and this concept is described very well, and the best parts of the thesis is based on empirical studies. And this concept has been made public through papers, and the cluster analysis is a very convincing part that contributes a lot to the author's concepts. And the BRICS as a political and trade and economic association that is designed to boost international cooperation in the is playing a great role in the international economic cooperation, and new arguments are of course put forward, and especially in response to the collapse of market relations and to the deterioration of market relations, and the public intervention is there as well. But there's some disadvantages in the work that really of discussion type and about global governance. The International Conference on Global Governance. So the notion of global governance, how do you define that? Is it through in participation in a global economy, or is it reforming a global economy? So how does BRICS influence international trade? And this needs to be defined as well. You have to also explain how the UN and the WTO classifies these countries. But on the whole, the thesis of Martin Pioch is an original research piece, and written on a very relevant topic, has originality and practical importance. This thesis complies with the requirements of St. Petersburg State University regarding this type of work. Thank you very much, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich. The next, Kurt Jacobite. Are you ready, Kurt Jacobite?
Thank you very much. Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me nice and clear. So, Mr. Chairman, dear members of the review committee, let me repeat my apologies for the somewhat late submission of my review. I'm glad that you did not hold it against the defendant, because it's just my fault only. Let me echo some of the statements that my colleagues on the review committee already made about the quality of the dissertation by Martin Pioch. I think it is a very clearly and convincingly structured piece of academic achievement. It does include a very systematic introduction where the main foci of the research are listed. It is somewhat short in comparison to what we normally make as the requirement for a dissertation, but I think Martin Pioch's work makes up for this by originality, by the depth of the empirical analysis, and by this mixed methods approach that he pursued, by also enriching his arguments by qualitative interviews. Now, I will not go into the details of the structure of the dissertation. I will not repeat the many findings, but I have a few issues that I listed at the end of my review, and maybe I can explain them in a bit more detail before coming to a final, if you like, conclusion on my assessment of the dissertation. Now, I think first that, as my colleague did with her first presentation, I took issue with the first sentence, which is listed on page 184 of Martin's dissertation, where he claims that, I quote, "International trade is today the main driver of the global economy." I would argue that this held true, this observation held true until the onset of this larger financial crisis, a crisis that for the first time in many decades originated in the West and not somewhere else, either in the South or in the periphery, if you like, but really in the West, and that has really been at the throat, in particular, of many countries at the southern periphery of the European Union. But what is essentially embedded with the onset of this crisis is the fact that until 2008, the growth rate of global trade was more, by and large, double the growth rate of the world GDP, the world gross domestic product. And this essentially holds no longer true for the last 10 years. And I read the debate in international political economy as largely about what that means for global trade, what that means for globalization, and what the indicators are that one would have to take into account to make sense of this. My reading is this has a lot to do with a fundamental shift in the nature of global trade. It is no longer that much the trade in goods, but substantially the trade in digital, elements, services, etc., that are not captured in the same sense in the growth rates of trade. So somewhat this concentration on trade, as valid as it may be, I would think that we are witnessing a time where probably other issues have to be taken more into account. One were to explain why is that the case, why is global trade no longer the driver for global growth or no longer ahead of global growth? I think there are a number of things that are debated. One would of course be the relocation that has a lot to do with the rise of robotics and automatization in production. So global value chains, which used to drive globalization processes for many decades until 2008, are probably at the brink of a development where particular industrial production will be relocated to the centers in the Western world. And that would definitely then imply that there is a smaller amount of increase in global trade. And I dare not even ask the questions what that will mean for developing countries or emerging economies as a perspective for them to join in the global growth dynamics. That's probably an issue that is going to take us way too far, but the first sentence is simply one that is, to my reading, a bit provocative. And maybe thinking about, adding a footnote to it in the revision of the dissertation, then I think Martin Pioch should reconsider this first sentence. I have a second issue that I not worrisome, but at least something that takes issue with Martin's claim that there is a lack in the literature in international relations theory and in international political economy, where the empirical evidence of where the BRICS countries are really situated in world trade is not there, is not covered in enough detail. And I think that the literature on the varieties of capitalism, that is also an emerging field and an expanding field, is reaching similar conclusions and similar results when it comes to the differences and commonalities among the BRICS. I took a small issue with Martin's distinction between cooperation and cooperation or harmonization. From the understanding in particular of international relation theory, the contrast is always more between coordination and cooperation. It's not between harmonization and cooperation. So taking that, then the contrast would rather be that the BRICS are not really fully cooperating, but they are very good or increasingly good at coordinating their stance. For example, in the bodies of the WTO or in other international fora. The density of the BRICS cooperation is facilitating a much better coordination of their positions. And fourth and finally, on a more technical note, I was not stunned, but at least this is something that I would recommend to add to the dissertation, that when one lists the persons that one interviewed in terms of qualitative interviews that were conducted during the research phase of the dissertation, it is also advisable to list the key questions that were asked to get into these qualitative interviews. Otherwise, these were just simple background talks. If it's just a chat, if you like, with experts, that's also fine enough. It's also a possibility to gain and to gather evidence. But if you want to conduct them and to present them as expert interviews, then it makes sense to simply say what were the key topics that you tried to raise with all these 15 people when you were talking to them. That should be also in the addendum to the dissertation. But as I said at the beginning, my reading of the entire dissertation is that it is a fine example, and as a matter of fact, the first example of a dissertation that comes out of this PRIMO project, the project within the 7th Research Framework Program of the European Union, where St. Petersburg was a very much welcome partner. We started out with this notion that in order to better understand global order and global developments, it's of paramount importance to give a voice to those parts of the world. I hope you can still see me. Well, yes, there you are. I don't know what went wrong. Yes, wonderful. The PRIMO spirit, as I mentioned, is an attempt to really give voice to the emerging powers, to the developing world, to new partners in the global order that have an increasingly important role to play, and that it is no longer advisable to simply take a purely Western or a purely whatever position, but to include the plurality and the diversity of positions and arguments if one does an analysis of a policy field in international relations or in the global order, be it trade or anything else. So a fine example of that. And to my mind, there is no doubt whatsoever that Martin Pioch fully deserves the award of the degree of St. Petersburg State University for his dissertation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now I should give the floor to myself to just put forward some suggestions related to the dissertation.
The dissertation, in my view, is very important, is very significant, very relevant, because the topic is understudied, and also because the knowledge about how things, institutions of global governance will develop in the WTO, and also within this institution or with other institutions are, very important. And I wouldn't overestimate it to say that not many researchers are interested in that. If you look at the structure of national security, China and Russia are put as revisionist powers, and that are a danger to the world order after the Second World War. And in this light, the way that Martin is trying to define the prospects of the BRICS is very important. And as I already mentioned, this dissertation covers a key issue: why countries cooperate. In international relations, there's another one: why do people fight? Why do countries fight? And you don't have to have a new pattern of competitive advantages in order to drive countries to cooperate. If they complement each other, there's even more stable cooperation emerging. And the second question, how these international organizations, institutions emerge, develop, evolutionize, and what prospects, for example, the case study of BRICS, to become a full-fledged international association union, as we see that BRICS is a forum for key players to discuss and to reduce transaction costs as an institution of socialization, where countries have approximately member states have equal status in the international arena, and this is an instrument that the member countries are trying to use in furthering their political, economic international agenda, and it would be interesting to see how the strategies of different member countries change vis-à-vis this organization. For example, Russia views BRICS as an international power in the near future, but other countries would not be so optimistic. And so, and I also agree with the colleagues that the most interesting thing section is the third chapter, where the cluster analysis is provided, and where the key elements of originality of this research are contained. Therefore, notwithstanding, I have some comments, of this point of criticism that I would like to cite. They don't question the conclusions, but the goal of any economic research has to do with some prognosis and identify some factors that would influence the future of BRICS. Because BRICS is a dynamic institution, and what we see in the cluster analysis is more of a static nature. As what we see in the materials that that's contained in the work about the dominating role of China within BRICS, we could say maybe China would become in the near future a leader of the group, akin to the situation with the leading role of the USA with the G7. So what do you think would be the most probable scenario? Are there equal partnership, or organization, or dominated by one leading power? And there are a lot of studies about the group of 7, about the group of 20, by Curtin, for example. And then the second question has to do with the prospects of the transformation into a full-fledged international organization, and the implications of such transformation for the global governance. So these are the issues that I would like you to comment on. And in conclusion, I would like to say that the dissertation of Martin Pioch could be of great interest to the Russian-speaking audience, readership, because not only European colleagues feel a lack of literature about emerging powers, but also Russia feels the same, and maybe with some editing, the dissertation could become a good monograph for the specialists. Thank you.
Review. So the next part are the defendants' replies to members of the dissertation board recommendations and comments. Martin, the floor is yours, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your very interesting comments and questions. I really appreciate how deeply you analyzed my work, actually. It was a pleasure to listen, and I will probably not have time to go into all questions into full detail, but if I've left something out, please don't hesitate to ask me later. Also, I would like to apologize for any formal mistakes, either in the English test or in the Russian translation. This definitely should not have happened. Further, some of the questions or the prods were very helpful suggestions of clarification of some parts of the thesis. Thank you also for those. I will definitely consider them and try to express these in further publications. So, to the points. 3 of the reports criticized that I claimed in the introduction that international trade is the main engine of the world economy, especially since the financial crisis of 2008. Other factors as investment or relocation of production might have been more important for world economic growth. I totally agree. Maybe the formulation, one of the main engines, might have sounded swifter. However, I would still like to stress the extraordinary role of trade, because trade might have slowed down recently. However, I would argue that trade is the foundation of our world economy, especially if you use the term world economy. So I would still argue that trade is not only historical, but also still today the necessary foundation of globalization. Without other processes would never have taken place, of the international exchange of goods, people and services. Then just a short clarification, when I wrote the word infrastructure of the WTO, then of course I mean the institutional infrastructure, the services and possibilities the WTO offers to its members, the WTO law, and the different places where the countries can go and get help. Further, I use the term duty-free because the WTO itself uses the term duty-free in that country tariff profiles. All of the variables from the tariff cluster analysis are taken one-on-one out of the WTO tariff profiles, so the terminology comes from there. Further, I was asked why I use the simple average tariff lines and not the weighted tariff lines. A very good question, which I was already asked a lot, especially during my stay in Oxford. There are 2 simple reasons. First, the data of weighted tariff lines is only available for much less countries, and it doesn't make sense to have a 160 country cluster analysis and an 80 country cluster analysis. It's not comparable. However, secondly, I have done that, and everybody can check this on the WTO website of trade and tariff maps. Even if we apply the weighted tariff lines, the BRICS tariffs are still comparable higher than the tariff of the developed countries. The results would be more or less the same. With one exception, probably Brazil would be in a much more protectionist cluster. Shortly about the interviews. The interviews were open interviews without fixed standard questions. Therefore, originally this thesis contained another 50 to 60 more pages where I summarized and transcribed the interviews. Due to translation issues and in cooperation with the dissertation administration of the university, we have left this other 60 pages of transcription of the interview out. I would be pleased to also, Professor Jakobait send them, but this was originally inside. Fixed standard questions were not there. I didn't ask the same questions to everybody because it's different on the position they were. Then I accept also the suggestion from Professor Isachenko and also from Professor Jakobait that a short comparative analysis of the basic economic development strategies of the BRICS or of their variations of capitalism would be helpful. I clearly understand that such an analysis of different approaches would be very beneficial for the BRICS studies as a whole. I was very often asked about specific BRICS countries, about Russia's or India's strategies in trade and so forth. However, This would not serve the purpose of this thesis, because I do not focus on the difference and similarities of the BRICS countries as 5 BRICS sample, or as 5 BRICS and maybe 8 or G7. I focus here on the difference and similarities of the BRICS in a sample of 160 countries, and I cannot compare the variations of capitalism and the development strategies of 160 countries. I could probably, but this is a different thesis, this is a different topic. Further, I would like to stress that the logic of the BRICS in the WTO might not have been clear at first sight, because the BRICS were not created in any direction connection with the WTO. The WTO has become, however, a symbol in research for emerging economies as a testing ground for new political power, especially for Brazil and India in the last decade, and currently also for China. Many problems of the institutions have indirectly to do with the transition towards a more multipolar world order in recent years. The main argument for the EU, for example, for TTIP, was to create the rules of the future before others will do them. While the BRICS on their summit declarations also mention that they have some ambitions to formulate those new rules. So there is a connection. However, so far the BRICS have not come up with any agenda yet, how they would look like. I was also asked about the role of China in the future of the BRICS. If it might be similar to the G7, which was assumed as to be led by the United States, or if it's a more equal relationship. Well, I think power dynamics are never stable. They're always shifting. I would further argue that the US leadership in the G7 has currently lost a little bit of strength and is under consideration. About the BRICS, I have to strengthen that the BRICS have a very, very different purpose than, for example, the OECD world, the NATO, and so on. The BRICS approach is about living respectfully next to each other, not in finding a common agenda which they can push forward. This is also one of the main results of this thesis. The BRICS do not push an agenda or idea where a leadership from China could be used. Surely, the BRICS are all aware of China's power, but in the security sector, I don't see cooperation between India, China, or Russia on a level that is comparable with the NATO, for example, a forum where leadership might be needed. The proclaimed friendship approach of the BRICS has this simple framework of friendship, but not of deep cooperation. However, and quite interestingly, are those socializing effects the BRICS offer for the countries. The BRICS, for example, offer, especially South Africa, leverage and access in its bilateral possibilities towards China, which without the BRICS, South Africa probably would not have. I vote that the BRICS prefer bilateral relations between each other. However, their multilateral meetings and multilateral cooperation offers new contexts and open doors which without this multilateral meeting of those 5 would probably have stayed closed. This directly relates to the next question about the transformation of the BRICS into an international organization. I don't see that coming, neither sooner nor later. The main reference institutions would be regional approaches, Mercosur, EU, SADC, and so on. And if they follow global approaches, they probably simply need more members. 5 is not enough for that, I think. And I also don't think that the BRICS will become something like, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which may be close connected to them, but it's too global, and I don't think this will happen, in my opinion. But the BRICS have a huge integration potential if they would be ready to lead with responsibility, which is a very different debate. But the potential that those countries offer, which is then in the literature discussed and often used as, okay, this potential is reality, so they are strong as a group together. So far, they haven't come up to use this potential. Also, strengthening of the BRICS to better counter current US administration is, in my point of view, not helpful. Why would China, for example, want to have Russia sit on the table when they speak about trade balance with the United States? China will claim this is domestic and bilateral interests of China with the US. Participation of Brazil and India would also not help. At the same time, why would Brazil or South Africa want to speak about the US-Russia relations when they speak with Washington about their bilateral relations? I don't see help here, and I don't see leverage of strengthening of single countries' bargaining positions. When the EU and the US started to sanction Russia related to the Ukraine conflict, many expected China to jump in, and also China gave immediately some credits to Russia. But overall, Chinese investment dropped by 30% after the sanctions. So I think this tells something. Also, I think if one would really like to access the value add of the BRICS for the global governance system, then a constructivist view on international politics is necessary. The BRICS, as mentioned, have socializing effects inside of international institutions. First of all, the BRICS format is there to help the BRICS. It is an approach of diversification of their international relations. This might lead to new ideas, however, as I've shown, not in trade. I would, however, reject optimism about the concentration of strengths inside of the BRICS. Yes, if we add up the numbers together, the BRICS are really huge. But so far, they lack the political will and the consensus to use this power actually in a reformative will together. So far, at the WTO, we can observe that the BRICS only protect one another. Finally, I need to address a question about global governance. I've written in my thesis that I refer to the work of Barnett and Duval from 2005, where they define global governance as governance and rulemaking on a global level. This can happen in many different global arenas. Obviously, for this work, I've chosen the WTO, and there the participants are only countries. Global governance can, however, include also other actors and other decision-making processes. The term, however, refers to a system of rulemaking that has no world government that can decide what to do, but it is based on the willingness and on the participation of the members. The countries, as participants, remain the sovereigns. Once again, I would like to express my deep gratitude for those valuable and constructive comments, questions and suggestions, also to the translator, a tremendous job, and I'm open to further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, distinguished members of the Dissertation Board. Do you have any other questions on the defendant's replies? Would you like to follow up? If not, well, before we give the floor to the research supervisor of Martin, I would like to address members of the audience, but not members of the Dissertation Board, whether someone would like to take the floor. Please introduce yourself before taking the floor. Good afternoon, distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, distinguished members of the audience. My name is Alexandra Kovalova. I'm candidate of Economic Sciences, assistant professor of the World Economy Department. I was the coordinator of Prima Marie Curie Network in St. Petersburg University. Martin is a participant of this program. So the dissertation that he has produced is the result of his investigations within the framework of this program. Many times, the high value of the dissertation has been highlighted today. I would like to note that this international exchange program brings together universities of BRICS countries, Hamburg University, Oxford University, and this allowed to improve largely the methods available to young researchers, and the very program is there to promote younger scholars by way of international inter-university cooperation. I believe that this defense has yielded the positive results. This is one of the few dissertations written initially in English. This is something unparalleled for St. Petersburg University, which highlights the high level of this dissertation. Martin is the first postgraduate to defend his dissertation within the framework of this project, and this is a new step forward for the university and for younger scholars in producing their research. I believe that St. Petersburg University will go on cooperating with other international universities. I'm confident that we will be more successful in our academic endeavors. Thank you, Alexander. I would like now to give the floor to the research supervisor of our defendant, Sergei Supirin.
Спасибо большое, господин
Thank
председатель,
you very
уважаемые
much,
коллеги.
dear colleagues.
Позвольте пару слов.
I would like to say a few words
Поскольку весь
because, yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. Again, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. A few words. I would like to say that since BRICS is a great illustration of the statement, there was a word first, and first was the word, and in order to you have to look at this word to see what if there's any substance behind it in the economic sphere, and this is what Martin was trying to do, and especially and other colleagues looked at the same thing from an investment point of view, and this is about the relevance of the work. On the one hand, we have a very good researcher with a great potential, and whether his life is connected with this research area or something else, this potential will be there, will be implemented, I'm sure. As far as the content, well, without reiterating what the others said, as far as the cluster analysis, there are two key points here. This clusterization of trade and the clusterization of trade policy. And this is a very interesting topic, which I try to think about. What is done at the level of international policy? How can it get spelled over to real international links, trade links? And what we see in Martin's work, there's some optimism there. And about the interviews, this is a very interesting result because it's hard to organize these interviews, and the experts in Russia and abroad, when you have to conduct interviews yourself, not drawing data from different research papers, is much more difficult. Of course, we talked about it, and of course, we discussed it with Martin. Martin and I discussed it that we cannot see the final instance in any expert, and I think that Martin has done a great job and is entitled to the third degree. Thank you. Dear colleagues, we have a stage when Dissertation Council members are going to discuss the verdict, and I would like the sound to be switched off, and people that are not members of the Dissertation Council, please leave the room for this time, and you'll be invited back into the room when when our discussion is over. Dear colleagues, our session is on again, and the sound should be switched on. So everything is working, okay? So I'm putting a question about the award and the degree. I remind you that the positive decision is taken if more than half of the Dissertation Council members vote positively according to the procedure of granting the candidate of science degrees in St. Petersburg State University. Your opinion? I am in favor of the SOD degree in economics, St. Petersburg State University. Thank you. A member of Council, Konstantchenko, again. I vote for granting the degree in economics to Mr. Pioch and Professor Kadishnikov. I also vote for granting the degree in economics to Mr. Pioch. Court Jacobite, what's your opinion?
Yes, I'm also in favor of awarding the degree to Martin Pioch.
And as the chairman of the Dissertation Council, I also vote in favor of the decision to award the SOD degree. So, dear colleagues and guests, out of the 5 members of the Dissertation Council present, 5 members voted for the decision to grant the degree, and no abstentions, no one voted against. So, the decision is thus taken. The concluding word to the defendant now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Great relief, great work. I would like to mention that this 3 years that brought me 2 years of the time here and 1 year of the time to other places was a real pleasure, a real good experience and insight. I have to strongly thank, even if it's my dissertation, I would work without Alexander Kova. Nothing of this would have been possible in the coordination, in the administrative stuff. It was just tremendous. Thank you for that. Also, Professor Sutilin, thank you for your support through all this time. I highly appreciate it, and I highly appreciate that you looked in my thesis. And well, I can only say this didn't only make my personally, I grew up a lot during this time and had a lot of personal experiences and positive effects. Also, the work on this topic was really interesting, and it opened up so many more questions, as I think we also already saw here in the discussions. There are like, I think only in this discussion we found out 4 or 5 different possibilities for dissertations, because you can look in these areas, and so far little has been done there, so there is a need. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Congratulations. The session is over. Thank you very much for attendance, and the sound should be switched on now. Thank you.